You people don't usually fly first class, Madison sneered loud enough for half the cabin to hear, just before slapping Danielle's phone, and then her face. The cabin froze. No one moved, no one spoke, but every passenger knew in that instant something irreversible had just happened at 37,000 feet. Under the cool hum of fluorescent lighting at Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport, travelers surged toward their gates with a mix of practiced precision and anxious energy. At Gate B19, the crowd had begun to split economy passengers, lining up like a slow-moving river to the left, while the premium lane remained nearly empty save for one woman. Danielle Carter stood alone in the first-class lane, a figure of composed elegance in a deep burgundy travel blazer, her silver-streaked locks swept neatly into a low bun. At 56, Danielle radiated a kind of unshakable calm, the product of decades spent leading high-stakes negotiations and steering Solaritech International into one of the most valuable privately held tech firms in North America. With over 1.4 million air miles logged, the ritual of boarding had become second nature. Platinum card in hand, ticket on screen and passport ready. She wasn't here to prove she belonged. She had built the kind of life where first class was the standard, not the exception. That didn't stop the gate agent from trying to remind her otherwise. "Excuse me, ma'am," Lindsay called out sharply, her voice cutting through the ambient noise like a blade. "That line is for Diamond and First only. Economy is boarding down at C-15. Danielle turned her head slowly, meeting the agent's gaze with the steady grace of someone who had been here before, too many times before. "I am aware," she replied, voice smooth as polished glass. "This is my flight, and this is my lane." She extended her phone, the boarding pass clearly reading Seat 3C, first class, with the elite traveler icon glowing in green. Lindsay took the phone with a skeptical arch of her brow, flipping the screen over, as if searching for signs of forgery. "And your ID?" she asked unnecessarily. Danielle handed it over without a word. A white couple stepped into the lane behind her. Without even asking for credentials, Lindsay waved them through with a syrupy welcome aboard. Danielle remained still. Lindsay returned her ID and boarding pass a moment later, her smile strained. "You're all set," she said curtly, stepping aside. No apology, no warmth. Danielle walked the jet bridge with even strides, not rushing, not reacting. She had made it a rule years ago, never let them see you flinch. As she stepped into the cabin of Flight 892 bound for Zurich, the contrast in reception was immediate. Passengers in coach were herded with polite detachment. But up front in the leather-scented enclave of first-class flight attendant, Madison greeted a suited man ahead of Danielle with a beam of practiced hospitality. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Langston." "Champagne." The smile vanished the second Madison saw Danielle. "Economy is through the curtain, and to the right," she said, without checking her boarding pass. Danielle paused. "Actually, I'm in 3C, she replied, presenting the ticket. "First class." Madison blinked clearly, taken off guard. "Let me see that," she said, tone tightening. She examined the screen like it might bite her. She said finally with evident reluctance. "Row 3, yes, on the left." Danielle moved to her seat, fully aware of Madison's eyes on her back. She placed her leather carry-on in the overhead bin, took her window seat and began arranging her personal items, journal, travel pillow charger, into the small cubby beside her. Across the aisle, the white businessman who had received the bubbly was already sipping a second glass. No champagne had been offered to her. As the cabin filled with the hushed buzz of executives settling into their routines, laptops opening, noise-canceling headphones adjusting, Danielle remained poised. She watched Madison offer champagne to every passenger in the 16-seat cabin except for her. It wasn't subtle. It wasn't even plausible as oversight. It was routine, deliberate erasure. She pressed her call button. The soft chime echoed above. Minutes passed. Madison walked by twice, attending to passengers who had called for assistance after Danielle. The light above seat 3C remained lit. Ignored. The meal service began an hour after takeoff. Madison and another attendant wheeled gleaming carts forward, the scent of truffle oil and saffron drifting through the cabin. "For our first course tonight," Madison chirped, "we have seared halibut over wild rice, or a portobello tart with goat cheese reduction." She addressed the man across the aisle by name. "Mr. Thompson, would you prefer the white burgundy or the rosé pairing?" Danielle was skipped again. The cart passed by her row without slowing. The attendant served the man next to her, and reached over her tray table to hand a napkin, never acknowledging her presence. It was a dance of precision and insult choreographed to look like protocol. She waited until the main courses were halfway through being served before pressing the call button again. Still no response. After a third press, Madison finally approached her face tight. "Yes," she said flatly. "I haven't been served," Danielle said calmly. "Not an appetizer, not a drink. I'd like the seafood option I selected when I booked." Madison let out a theatrical sigh. "We're out," she said. "All we have left is a pasta from economy. You can take that or nothing." The words stunned nearby passengers into uncomfortable stillness. Danielle met Madison's gaze. "That's unacceptable." Madison leaned closer, loud enough for the adjacent seats to hear. "You people don't usually fly first class. Don't expect us to hold a meal for you." A murmur rippled through the cabin. Danielle, still calm, took out her phone. "I'd like to document this interaction," she said evenly. She began recording. Madison's smile vanished. "You put that down right now," she snapped. And then with startling speed, she slapped the phone from Danielle's hand and slapped her across the cheek. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the pressurized silence. Gasps erupted. A man 3 rows up turned in shock. Madison stepped back immediately. "She threatened me," she shouted. "She was filming me without consent. She's aggressive." The lead flight attendant arrived seconds later. "What's going on?" she demanded. "This woman's been causing problems since she boarded," Madison said quickly. "She won't stop harassing the crew." Danielle didn't respond. She sat straight, hands folded, face neutral. Her cheek burned, but her pride didn't bend. She watched them try to rewrite the moment, to weaponize assumptions, to flip the script as they'd likely done before, with no cameras, no proof, no consequence. But this time they'd chosen the wrong passenger. Inside, Danielle felt something settle into place. A memory, a promise, a line crossed one too many times. She had come to this flight quietly, anonymously, ready to observe. But now she was going to change the entire altitude of this airline, starting from seat 3C. And Madison had just written her own resignation with an open hand. Danielle Carter didn't move. Her cheeks still stung, a slow burn radiating beneath the surface of her skin, but her expression remained unreadable. Around her first-class passengers pretended to be preoccupied with screens and meal trays, but the silence in the cabin told another story, one of shock, complicity, and growing discomfort. The slap hadn't just landed on Danielle's face. It had struck the illusion of civility that cloaked air travel in rituals and hierarchy. Madison, the flight attendant, who had just committed that very public assault, stood tense and defensive, eyes darting toward the galley where she knew reinforcements would come. And they did. The lead attendant appeared, assessing the scene with narrowed eyes and a swift judgment that needed no evidence. "What happened here?" she asked, her voice clipped. "This passenger was being disruptive," Madison declared, almost rehearsed. "She refused to follow instructions and started recording me without consent." Danielle said nothing. She didn't argue, didn't defend herself. Instead, she calmly reached down and retrieved her phone, checking it with slow, deliberate precision. The camera app had continued rolling even after it hit the carpeted floor. Madison's voice, the slap, the accusation, all caught clearly, unmistakably. Still, Danielle didn't play the footage yet. There would be time for that. Now she needed space, and she needed silence. "I need to use the lavatory," she said coolly, her voice level, despite the churn in her chest. The lead attendant didn't object. She stepped aside with an eye roll, thinly masked as professional detachment. Danielle walked slowly down the aisle, ignoring the glances that followed her like shadows. Once inside the small first-class lavatory, she locked the door, placed the toilet lid down, and sat. The sterile light overhead buzzed faintly. From her handbag, she withdrew a slim, matte black device, smaller than a phone, weightier than it looked. A satellite communicator. It operated beyond the standard air-to-ground systems and was used only when being unreachable wasn't an option. Danielle turned it on, and the screen glowed softly. No signal bars. Just one line, secure channel ready. She keyed in a number from memory. Within 3 rings, a voice answered. Ms. Carter, the woman on the other end, said, instantly alert. "Status boarding went as expected. Crew performance is in line with previous concerns. I've experienced verbal hostility, discriminatory service, and physical assault. I need you to inform Chairman Renner immediately. Use Protocol Zeta. There was a pause. Understood. Confirming you are invoking Zeta. Confirmed. Danielle disconnected, sat in silence for another beat, then took a steadying breath. She smoothed her blazer, checked the mark on her cheek in the mirror, faint but visible, and exited the lavatory. Back in the cabin, Madison and the lead attendant huddled near the galley. Neither looked in her direction. They laughed under their breath, the kind of laughter reserved for those who believe they'll never be held accountable. What they didn't know was that by the time they landed, everything they believed about power on this aircraft would be rewritten. 37,000 feet above the Atlantic, inside the fortified silence of the cockpit, Captain Jonas Harrington had just received a communication unlike any other in his 28-year career. A direct transmission from Altair Airways, Chairman Elias Renner, Emergency Override Protocol, Priority Alert. The screen on his communication console flashed red. The message was brief, but its weight was unmistakable. Passenger in seat 3C is Danielle Carter. As of this morning, she is the majority shareholder and CEO of Altair Airways. You are instructed to take full command authority and address the situation immediately. Acknowledge. Captain Harrington stared at the screen, then swiveled in his seat to face First Officer Delgado, who had been monitoring their course. You're not going to believe this, he muttered. The captain unbuckled his harness and rose, something he had done mid-flight only twice in his entire tenure, and never under circumstances like these. He opened the cockpit door, stepped into the first-class cabin, and walked directly to the galley. We need all flight attendants here. Now, he said, voice low but firm. Madison's head jerked up. Captain, now. Within 30 seconds, the full crew was assembled. Madison, the lead attendant, and two others stood shoulder to shoulder in the narrow galley. Passengers turned to watch, sensing something serious unfolding. Harrington didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. You're all aware of an incident involving the passenger in 3C, he began, eyes fixed on Madison. I've just received a direct message from Chairman Renner. That passenger is Danielle Carter. She is now the CEO and controlling shareholder of Altair Airways. The silence that followed wasn't just quiet. It was heavy, like pressure in the cabin had dropped. Faces paled, eyes widened. Madison blinked rapidly, mouth slightly open, but unable to speak. The lead attendant let out a shaky breath. We didn't know, she whispered. That Captain Harrington said is the problem. Behind them, the curtain swished as a few passengers leaned closer to eavesdrop. Word was spreading fast. She has full executive authority, Harrington continued. Every action taken against her since boarding is under review and being documented. I suggest you carry out the rest of this flight with extreme professionalism. He paused, giving them one final look. Dismissed. He turned and walked directly to Danielle's seat. Ms. Carter, he said with respectful formality, is there anything I can do for you? Danielle looked up, her voice still calm, still composed. No, Captain. I've taken care of what needs to be done. Harrington gave a short nod. If there's anything you need before landing, don't hesitate to ask. He returned to the cockpit. Behind him, Madison and the crew dissolved like brittle paper under pressure. Their laughter had stopped. Their postures stiffened. A cold awareness began to settle in that the woman they'd humiliated wasn't just another passenger they could gaslight and ignore. She was the one person who held the power to end their careers with a single stroke of a pen. Danielle sat back in her seat, took out her phone, and opened the Notes app. She resumed her documentation line by line, timestamp by timestamp. 8:42 p.m. Skipped champagne service. 9:27 p.m. Ignored call button. 10:11 p.m. Denied meal, served cold pasta on plastic tray. 10:18 p.m. Verbal insult. You people don't usually fly first class. 10:19 p.m. Physical assault slap, captured partially on video. Across the aisle, passengers shifted uncomfortably. Some glanced at her with a mix of guilt and admiration. Others avoided her gaze entirely. Madison didn't return to her row. Another attendant, now visibly nervous, served her a proper glass of wine, offered a hot towel, and tried to smile. Danielle accepted none of it. She didn't need makeup service. She needed accountability. As the cabin lights dimmed for the overnight leg of the journey, whispers rippled through the rows. The atmosphere had changed. The usual detachment and entitlement that often came with first-class comfort had been replaced by a tension that no seat width or champagne refill could smooth over. Somewhere in the back of the plane, word had even started to trickle into economy. A flight crew had assaulted their CEO. There were rumors, hushed theories, quiet gasps. But for Danielle Carter, none of it mattered. She wasn't flying this route to make noise. She was here to observe the culture she now owned and decide who would stay, who would go, and what kind of legacy Altair Airways would build from this moment forward. At 2:16 a.m. over the Atlantic, while most passengers were asleep or pretending to be, Danielle's eyes remained open, watching, remembering, preparing. Because when they landed, the flight wouldn't end. It would only begin. When the wheels of Flight 892 finally touched down on the tarmac at JFK, the cabin lights flickered back to full brightness, waking some passengers from restless sleep and jarring others out of uneasy silence. But for those in first-class sleep had been a luxury none dared indulge after what had unfolded. The whispers had not stopped since the captain's mid-flight announcement, and now as the plane taxied toward the gate, there was an electric undercurrent pulsing through the cabin, tension, apprehension, and the unshakable sense that something monumental was about to happen. Danielle Carter sat upright in 3C, composed as ever, reviewing her notes one last time. Her tablet rested on her lap, her phone charged, and with the recording cued, lay face down on the tray table. She didn't need theatrics. The facts would speak for themselves. Across the aisle, passengers who had once ignored her now peeked awkwardly in her direction. A few offered her small silent nods of acknowledgement. Too late. The damage had been done. At the front of the plane, Captain Harrington's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to New York. Please remain seated as we complete arrival procedures. There will be a brief delay as airline leadership coordinates disembarkation procedures for first class. We appreciate your patience." It was the most subdued landing announcement any of them had heard. The moment the doors opened, the mood shifted. It wasn't the usual bustle of flight attendants snapping into deplaning mode. Instead, there was a presence, a line of dark suits visible just beyond the threshold, standing in a semicircle inside the jet bridge. Danielle stood only when Captain Harrington appeared beside her row. "Miss Carter, if you would follow me," he said, tone deferential. She nodded, collecting her belongings with graceful precision. As she stepped into the jet bridge, the air felt heavier, colder. Lined up before her were a collection of high-ranking executives from Altair Airways, including board chair Elias Renner, flanked by senior legal counsel, the VP of Operations, and two officers from the NYPD. Behind them, a few reporters had already gathered cameras, poised questions loaded but unsaid. The media had been tipped off. This wasn't just an internal incident anymore. It was a story. Danielle said nothing as she passed the executives, not acknowledging the faint murmurs of "we're so sorry" or "this is unacceptable." At the far end of the jet bridge, she turned and waited. Captain Harrington gave the signal. Inside the aircraft, the cabin crew was summoned. One by one, they stepped off the plane, Madison, the lead attendant, and the two others who had turned blind eyes and deaf ears for the entire flight. Their faces were pale now. Madison looked like she hadn't taken a full breath in an hour. Her hair, once perfect, was limp around her shoulders. The late attendant's shoulders sagged as if she already knew what was coming. "Line them up," instructed one of the officers. They stood in a row facing Danielle, passengers still deplaning behind them, some stopping mid-step to witness what had become a surreal spectacle. Danielle reached into her handbag and pulled out her tablet. She tapped the screen and turned the device around. The video played without sound, but it didn't need volume. The imagery was damning. Madison's mocking tone, the slap, the smirk, the exact moment when power became abuse. Danielle then gestured toward the monitors installed above the gate. Without warning, the internal security footage from the plane's cabin played on a loop, alternate angles, confirming every part of her experience, every exclusion, every lie, every act of calculated humiliation. The assembled crowd watched in silence. The executives looked stricken. The press scribbled furiously. The officers stepped forward. Madison Cole and Teresa Phillips, one said, reading from a notepad, "You are being placed under arrest for assault and violation of civil rights." "Please turn around." Gasps broke out among onlookers as cuffs were placed on the wrists of the two women. Madison began crying instantly. "I didn't know who she was," she wailed. "It wasn't personal. I didn't mean it like that." Danielle's eyes met hers, calm, steady, unimpressed. and that she said loud enough for everyone to hear is exactly the problem. It should never matter who someone is. You don't withhold basic dignity until you recognize power. You give it because every human being deserves it. The NYPD led the two attendants away, their uniforms now a haunting echo of the arrogance they'd worn just hours earlier. As the camera shutters clicked, Danielle turned to address the gathered executives. This was not an isolated incident. It was a symptom. A culture that tolerates casual bias, quiet cruelty, and unchecked privilege. But that culture ends today. Chair Renner stepped forward, face ashen. Ms. Carter, he began, on behalf of Altair Airways. I extend our most profound apology. What happened on that flight was unacceptable. Yes, Danielle said firmly. It was, and I plan to make sure it never happens again. Within days, news of the incident exploded across national media. CEO assaulted by her own crew ran the headline on nearly every outlet. The video footage went viral. Altair Airways, once a quiet third-place player in the transatlantic market, became the center of one of the most high-profile reckonings in airline history. Under Danielle's direction, sweeping reforms were introduced within the first 30 days. Every employee, flight crews, gate agents, executives was required to complete extensive unconscious bias training, cultural competency modules, and recertification in customer equity standards. A complete overhaul of the leadership pipeline followed, prioritizing diverse talent and lived experience over legacy seniority. Within 6 months, the airline had launched its Dignity First initiative, making Danielle's voice and vision the cornerstone of its rebranding. Customer satisfaction among Black, Latino, Asian American, and disabled travelers soared 87%. Complaint volume dropped 93%, and internal morale, once flat and transactional, rebounded with unprecedented strength. Former crew members came forward anonymously to share their stories. We were trained to prioritize certain types of passengers, one former flight attendant admitted in an expose. It was never said directly, but it was clear some people belonged in first class and some didn't. Danielle Carter changed that from the top down. But perhaps the most poignant moment came 9 months later in a small home on the east side of Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Danielle sat at her father's kitchen table. He was a retired postal worker with arthritic hands and a worn smile. On the TV in the corner, a news segment replayed Danielle's now famous quote, "You should never have to prove your worth to receive basic respect." Her father looked at her with watery eyes. "You remember when you were 13 and that flight attendant tried to move us to the back, even though we'd paid for business class?" Danielle nodded. "You told me then one day you'd own the plane, that they wouldn't do that to us again." She reached across the table and took his hand. "I didn't just buy the plane, Dad," she said softly. "I changed the culture." A year to the day after that fateful flight, Danielle boarded Altair Airways. Flight 892 once more, same route, same time, same seat. As she entered the first-class cabin, a young Latina flight attendant greeted her with a warm smile. "Welcome aboard, Ms. Carter. May I offer you champagne or sparkling water? And thank you for everything you've done for this airline." Danielle smiled, placed her carry-on in the overhead, and sat in 3C. The champagne was chilled. The service was flawless. But more importantly, everyone around her, every background, every seat was being treated with the respect they had always deserved. Not because they were important, but because they were human. And in that quiet, luxurious cabin, Danielle Carter knew the work wasn't finished, but the flight had changed course. For good. In a world that often judges worth by appearance, power, or social status, Danielle Carter's story reminds us that true dignity begins with how we treat people when we think no one is watching and when we believe they hold no power over us. The flight crew didn't know who Danielle was. To them, she was just another Black woman in a place they subconsciously believed she didn't belong. But that snap judgment, that casual cruelty, ended up becoming one of the most expensive mistakes of their careers and one of the most powerful moments of reckoning for an entire industry. This story teaches us a critical lesson. Power does not always announce itself in loud voices or visible wealth. It often sits quietly observing, remembering, documenting. Danielle didn't retaliate in anger. She didn't raise her voice or cause a scene. She let the truth speak for itself, and when the moment came, she stood in it with strength, clarity, and conviction. For those of us watching this unfold, whether we've experienced discrimination, witnessed it, or unconsciously contributed to it, this is a wake-up call. The way we treat others, especially those who seem powerless, is the truest measure of our character. Respect isn't a reward for wealth or a reaction to status. It should be the baseline we extend to every person in every seat, on every flight, in every room. And to those who have been where Danielle was overlooked, questioned, disrespected, this story is for you. You are not invisible. You are not powerless. And your quiet strength may be the catalyst that forces the world to change. At Us, Justice Stories, we share these real and powerful narratives not just to expose injustice, but to inspire accountability, reflection, and hope. Because when people like Danielle choose composure over chaos and truth over retaliation, they don't just change companies, they transform cultures. Thank you for listening to today's story. If it moved you, if it made you think, if it reminded you of something you've seen or lived through, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. And in the comments below, let us know, have you ever experienced a moment where your worth was questioned, but you knew exactly who you were? We'd love to hear your story. From all of us at Us Justice Stories, thank you for standing with us. Let's keep telling the truth and keep pushing for a world where respect is no longer earned by title, but freely given through our shared humanity. See you in the next story.